A few months ago, I did a tips video on the Oscillating Multi-Tool. This is a great tool to have, and I believe everybody could benefit from it. But I had several people reach out and tell me a great way to save money with this tool is to actually sharpen your own blades. So here are 3 ways to do just that. Now before we start all of our sharpening techniques, we need to actually make a control cut. This is a brand new blade, and this is a piece of pine that's about 7/8 of an inch thick and about 1.5 inches deep. This will allow us to get a base cut, a base time that we need, knowing exactly how fast it should cut. And that way we can compare it to all of our sharpening techniques. Now I made 3 cuts with this blade because the very first one actually took a long time. I was quite surprised at how slow this was, and then I remembered this is some old growth pine. This is some really strong wood, and it cuts it, but it's slower than I thought it would be. So after the 3rd cut, I realized the best technique, which is to slightly move the tool back and forth as it's cutting, and it seemed to cut it the fastest. So with that said, we're going to make all those cuts with that same technique. I also just realized that the oscillating tool is on the lowest setting, which means the slowest cut. That explains some of that. But I'm going to keep it on this setting for the rest of the cuts as well. Now when you're using your oscillating tool, there's a very good chance you'll either hit some drywall screws or some nails. So I've put 3 drywall screws into this board here. I'm going to clamp this down, and I'm going to take that blade and cut into it and dull it up. Then we can start our sharpening. Now I've dulled up this blade pretty good. You can still see the slight grooves where each tooth should be, but it is pretty dull. I mean, run my finger across it here, it's not sharp at all. But just for the heck of it, let's cut into this wood here with this blade as is, just to see what it'll do. Now I cut in this wood for about 30 seconds, and it maybe went in 1/8 of an inch, so this blade, it's definitely dull. Now for our first technique, I removed the blade from the tool, and I'm going to clamp this in my vise. If you don't have a vise, just clamp it down to something solid so it doesn't move around. Now for our first technique, we're going to be using some small files. You can usually buy these inexpensively in little kits. Now these right here might be slightly on the large side, but we're going to try them anyway. Now we want to take one of the corners of the files here, and we want to try and go into each of these valleys. Now we're mainly just trying to remove any burrs that are on the side, and just to give a slight point to each of these teeth. So we're not trying to press real hard, we're just trying to get in there and just give probably 3-4 strokes for each of those. And then we'll flip this around, do the same for the other side. And with just a couple of minutes of filing, let's see how well this will cut. Now that was a little bit slower than it was from the factory, but I mean that's to be expected. I dulled up this blade and only spent a couple of minutes trying to sharpen it. I have a feeling if I'd have spent a little bit more time on each of the teeth and give it a little bit longer, probably would cut even better. But overall, pretty good. Now I'm going to go back and dull up this blade once again on those screws like we did before, then we'll use our second technique. And the next way we're going to sharpen this blade is with a Dremel tool. We're first going to use one of these little drum sanders to knock off any burrs. And then we're going to use one of these little cut-off wheels to cut along each of those teeth. With this technique, the consistency of the teeth will be only as good as the steadiness of your hand. So it's not going to be perfect, but it is just a resharpen. So let's see how well it's going to do. Now from what I can tell, the time to cut the wood between the cutoff wheel that we sharpened it with and the files that we used to sharpen it with took about the same amount of time. So therefore both of these are comparable. Now let's dull that blade one more time. At the beginning of the video I said there was 3 ways to sharpen your blade, but for those of you who wait till the end, I'll show you a bonus 4th technique. Now let's say you don't have a Dremel tool or you don't have the small files. Let's look at version number 3, which is using an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. Now this cutoff wheel is much thicker than the other blade that we use, so these teeth will be a little bit bigger. But let's try it out and see how it compares to the other 2. Now as you can tell here, these grooves are pretty large, especially compared to the factory edge, which you almost can't see in the video. But not only did I go in, I actually touched the top and the bottom up just a little bit to make these a little extra sharp. Let test number 3 begin. Now this third sharpening technique was not as efficient as the other two. It's still much better than a dull blade, which hardly could cut it all. Now because the teeth are so far apart, I have a feeling that's the problem. If you have some of the tools, I think some of your oscillating tools do have a little bit wider of an oscillating movement, which might work better with this setup. But overall, I'd leave this sharpening technique probably as a last resort. Now if you can get a much thinner blade for your angle grinder, which I'm not sure if they do sell those or not, but if you can, it would probably work much better in this setup. So let's move on to bonus number 4. For the fourth technique, we're going to be using a bench grinder. If you don't have a bench grinder, that's okay. You can use an angle grinder with a grinding wheel on it. This just makes it a little bit easier. It makes the blade a little straighter. We're first going to use the front of the wheel to knock off these teeth because we want this to be flat. Then we're going to move to the side of the wheel to sharpen up this edge. Now with this kind of sharpening on your blade, I don't recommend trying to cut your big thick wood pieces. It probably won't do very good. Now this would be great for say rubber or any kind of foam. Maybe trying to renovate a house, this would work great for you in those situations. Or if you have some paint or some caulking stuck to your floor, this would make a great scraper to get those off. Now if you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out our 20 tips video for the Oscillating Multi-Tool. You should enjoy that one as well. Otherwise, get on your shop and have fun building.